Dear moderator, speakers, participant, I am Amel Al-Breiki. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory. Thank you for joining us, and I am honored to have you back with us for the first Trends Political Islam e-forum, Path to Caliphate, the truth behind Muslim Brotherhood projects. Tonight, in the third symposium of the series, we are going to discuss brotherhood and the media, between ideology and politics. From its early days, the Muslim Brotherhood has acknowledged the significance of the media and its outreach, employing it to cultivate its rhetoric to an audience beyond their scope. The organization has strategically funded, supported, and put media outlets to use while adhering to its core ideology. The experts we have gathered tonight will shed light on the Brotherhood's media strategy, from its dual objectives, its rhetoric, to its finances and complicit supporters, emphasizing throughout the way its impact on the political scene. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, I thank all the panelists, the moderator, and participants worldwide who have joined us today to participate in the session. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I give the floor to our evening's moderator, Mr. Aqil Yunus. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Amal, and thank you for inviting me to moderate the discussion today. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good day to all of you, wherever in the world that you're watching from today. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers today, comprising subject matter experts from academia, the media, and also researchers from various parts of the world who've been studying the journey and progress of the Muslim Brotherhood over the years. Today's topic will delve specifically into the Brotherhood's media rhetoric and communication strategies, and how these have evolved over the years as the Ikhwan looks to expand its influence across the globe. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to go through some quick housekeeping rules. Firstly, each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present. We have a total of 8 speakers today, so I'd appreciate if everyone could keep their presentations short and succinct, just so that we have ample time to get into the Q&A at the end. And secondly, for the benefit of all speakers, there is an interpretation function available for this discussion. If you were to look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the interpretation tab, and we'll have the option to select either an Arabic or English interpretation. As we have 3 speakers today who will be speaking in Arabic, while the others will be speaking in English. When you do opt for that, please remember to also select mute original audio so that you're not hearing multiple voices at once. As for members of the audience who are joining us via YouTube and social media, you have the option of watching either in English or the Arabic version. So I won't waste any more time as we have plenty to discuss today. I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker for today. His name is Dr. Basil Bashir. Dr. Bashir is a senior researcher at the Trends Research and Advisory, and also a specialist on political Islam studies. His research interests include strategies, socio-political phenomena, religious movements, and security studies. He has a PhD in international media and a master's in sociology from Kiel University, United Kingdom. He worked as a lecturer at the Faculty of Arts, Baghdad University for about 20 years. He played an important role in establishing the media department at the University of Aden, Yemen, and has worked for many research centers. Dr. Bashir has also written numerous research papers in mass communication and political sociology. He continues to be a journalist and a writer on political, social, and human development. Dr. Bashir, the topic of Dr. Bashir's presentation will be the declared and concealed features and objectives of the Brotherhood's media rhetoric. So without any further ado, Dr. Bashir, the floor is yours.
Peace be upon you. Welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be with you at this symposium. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to my colleague and the other Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Al Ali, General Director of Trends and my colleague and brother, Mr. Ahmed Muhammad, who is the scientific advisor of trends, and Mr. Abdullah Al-Naqbi, director of the Department of Political Islam at the center. And I would like to thank the technical staff and logistic staff which organizes this symposium. And I hope that all of us can survive this coronavirus, and all humanity would survive it. Our lecture today is about Muslim Brotherhood and the media, between ideology and politics. In fact, we should know that the functions of public communication, the Muslim Brotherhood has managed to use it in the best way, except for the last function, which is entertainment. But it has focused on this function since 1928, when the Brotherhood was established, till today. All the functions of communications have been used in order to spread the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood throughout the world. But it has focused in these functions on two types of goals: to establish social, political, ideological goals of the Brotherhood, and another function which is using pragmatical communication, which means the speech of two sides, which will be targeting Muslims and Arab with one speech, and another speech for the West, which goes in line with what the West wants. The other point is that the Muslim Brotherhood, the rhetoric, starts from the idea of divine delegation. They say that in France, for example, when Louis XIV used to say, "I am France and France is me," and he started with the divine delegation, and this idea gives the Sultan the right not to be questioned, and it is him who gives order and decides anything that he wants. Besides, he is based on the comprehensiveness of Islam, and at this point, my dear colleagues, I would like to say that the comprehensive aspect of Islam, it's not here about the tolerant Islam that we know, but the Islam of Brotherhood, which is customized for Muslim Brotherhood. The types of Islam rhetorics of Muslim Brotherhood are of three types: ideological rhetorics to impose loyalty and obedience, and political and social educational rhetorics, and they were used by using a specific text from the Quran and from the Hadith. Also, the main ideological and philosophical and intellectual foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric were based on the divine delegation, which is that the general guide of the Muslim Brotherhood has the divine authority on the earth, and also the comprehensive aspect of Islam. It means that it can deal with different aspects of life. Also, the other point is that Islam is the solution. In the eyes of the Muslim Brotherhood, it is the solution to political, economic, and social issues. And also, the governance is for God, and we should have obedience only. So, governance to God and loyalty and obedience to the general guide, who will be governing based on Islam, and also the execution of Sharia and the construct Sharia based on the perspective of the Muslim Brotherhood. And another foundation which we have found in many texts, which is al-jihad, the call for al-jihad. This call to al-jihad has started with the Muslim Brotherhood since the 30s of the last century, when they established the special program. And Islam caliphate from one country to another until the Umayya nation. All the texts that started with media were according to the ideology and going in line with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in order to achieve their goals all over the world. The Muslim Brotherhood has used traditional means of communication starting from 1928 when they established their movement, and then they started using different outlets, started using symposium and lectures and also publications and books and a magazine like the first magazine of Muslim Brotherhood, and then they started having their own station, radio station, and then we started seeing them in social media. When we looked at different ideological and political features of Muslim Brotherhood means of communication from 1933 till 2013, date of issuance of the last version of the magazine of Freedom and Justice of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, we can see that it has infiltrated journalism and started spreading Islamic call to Islam according to Muslim Brotherhood, and not in the tolerant way that we have always known. They started calling for using the teaching of Islam to everyone else and considering that Islam is above everyone, but that was under the guidance of the general guide who should be obeyed. And it has focused also on boycotting the goods and the culture and the traditions of the West, which is considered as a combination of the Crusades and the Christian and Jewish. And they were instigating people to perform jihad against them. And we have seen that in many fields. They have also expanded their call to Islam by using different aspects. They have started also to support the Islam Caliphate according to modern means of communication. I would like to stop here at this point. The Muslim Brotherhood, when they run out of means, as it happened in 2013, when the Egyptian people turned against the Muslim Brotherhood and were protesting in Rabia place, they were saying we are going to blow up all the bridges and all the pubs and different establishments if Morsi does not return to power. And those were terrorist militia who were supporting them in Sinai. Another important point is that they have started ideological indoctrination. They started recruiting children and women and to brainwash them and fill them with the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood. They had TV stations starting with Al Jazeera TV network. Al Jazeera TV network has delivered immense services to Muslim Brotherhood, and we can say that Al Jazeera network was like the spokesman of Muslim Brotherhood and was supporting them in their operation and the main funding agent for their communications. And there are lots of websites of Muslim Brotherhood which support them, and we should mention that they have used the means of communication to spread the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood to encourage the call to Islam and also the social upbringing that they use at education, at schools that they had established, and that the mosques and the books, it was designed so that everyone would be convinced that Islam can teach the whole world, and they were mobilizing everyone politically and socially against the countries that were against Muslim Brotherhood, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Republic of Egypt. So it was attacking them non-stop. As a matter of fact, I think it's important for me to tell you that we have compiled the magazine of Islah in the UAE, which was issued from 1978 to 1994. I have compiled different texts about ideology. We want to know, what does the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood seeks to achieve by the media? And we found that they always repeated that Islam is the voice of truth and there's nothing above it. And they were always asking for ejecting the foreign labor. It means the Europeans and Americans, considering them as the enemy of the Muslims. And they wanted to ban all types of music. They want to ban all types of arts, whether it is drawing, cinema, everything like that should be banned. They wanted to ban the mixing between sexes, even at schools. And for the appreciation of the Muslim, they wanted that to be for the Muslims only, but not for other religions. And for the non-marriage of the Muslim and the occupations, and they also banned the celebration of Christmas and the Christian culture and Hindu culture, and they considered that as a taboo and should not be celebrated. There has been also some invitations to instill the culture of hatred in the hearts of the children at the expense of the believers of other religions like the Crusades and the Christian and the Jewish. And they were inviting Islam to be the teacher of the world, and they even started to ban the arts for children. And the Abu Dhabi TV was showing cartoons, and one day there was Mickey Mouse. They said, how can you show that to children? You are creating conciliation between the mouse and the cat, and this is not possible. But the country was withstanding all of that since 1978, and they were warned many times, but they did not respond, so they were banned. Considering the pragmatic approach, the Muslim Brotherhood from 1928 upwards, the Muslim Brotherhood had completely rejected the idea of the political parties, and in 2011 they established the political party of freedom and justice, and they said, we're Muslim Brotherhood, we refuse alliance. But in the elections of 1980s in Egypt, they allied with the Salafists, and they even allied with the Al-Qaeda organization, and they allied with the Al-Nusra terrorist organization. They allied with the Fath al-Sham organization. So they form different alliances. When they talk to the West, they say, we have no discrimination between men and women, but when the others, the Arab world, they say the woman should not study medicine, should not study aviation, engineering, and should only take care of her home, and maybe she can teach Arabic or Islamic religion. And also, when they talk about democracy to the West, they talk about the council of advising, but in the practical aspect, we can find that they exclude the others, they recognize nobody. And the proof is that Morsi, when they asked him to have election earlier, he refused and said that we at the Muslim Brotherhood, we do not accept that. So they refuse democracy. As for the question, when they address the West, and they say we have no difference between, we have no distinction between different religions. But when they deal with the Christian, the Coptic in Egypt, they consider them as infidels, as non-believers, and that their religion is not acceptable, and that they will go to hell, and they should not occupy high jobs at the state. And this is the picture, as you can see, in 2013, when the Egyptian people with the army had defeated the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they went to the White House and they took this picture, and they were wearing the American ties, although they were claiming they have an animosity with Washington. And as you can see, they were raising the finger as a sign of victory, or as a sign of number 4 in reference to Rabia, a place, as a sign of their resilience and defiance. Concerning the terms of communication of Muslim Brotherhood that they have been using since 1928, they use the term Muslim Brotherhood. This is like they have that aspect of brotherhood and fraternity. They have the slogan of the association, the sword and the Quran and the verses of Quran, and they use that as a threat also. And as for the term of the general guide, they took it from the Quran, when God said whoever is guided will be guided by God. So they took that and used it for the general director, general guide, Hassan al-Bunna, which means that he has the first divine delegation. And they have spoken about the teaching of the world, because this position of a teacher should be given to Islam, and Islam also can govern every country in the world. And there is the Council of Advising, and they call the supporter of Bayt al-Maqdis in Sinai, they don't call them as militia, they call them as people of Sinai. They use the approach of propaganda for their ideology and politics. They try to embody the good and the bad on the people. They use the approach of the unique enemy, and the unique enemy for them is Saudi Arabia, Republic of Egypt, Russia, and now France and Austria and the UAE. So any country that goes against their ideology, they consider it as the unique enemy. And they try also to touch on the emotions of people. They consider that they are always being victims. They call for reform, but nobody is giving them that chance. And they are also using the style of misleading and spreading rumors. Since 2013 till 2020, the features of the rhetoric of the Muslim Brotherhood has changed for a simple reason, is that after the failure of the experience of 1 year, 2013, when Muslim Brotherhood had ruled Egypt and failed, it has changed into a political conflict. They started to defend the Muslim Brotherhood governance. They felt that they lost authority and sacredness of their rhetoric. We know that Muslim Brotherhood, they had the leadership of Muhammad Bashir. Now we have 3 or 4 leadership after having added another section from Gaza State. They use also the approach of attack. When we look at the social media, we can see that they are using an obscene expressions that target some symbols of countries, or just because that goes against their style. Until now, in 2020, the communication means of Muslim Brotherhood, they still raise fear and suspicion against the Christians and the Coptics, and they are calling for moving to a political aspect. Why did this change happen? How did this communication speech change? It has changed. We have found how it changed based on different aspects. We found that there is a lack of competency from the leadership. There is a lack of satisfaction and trust from the leadership, and all those leaders have violated the bylaws, and many of them consider themselves as the main general guides of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are also using dictatorship against the Muslim Brotherhood itself. There is also a collision between the religious and the political thinking, and also between what is national and what is universal. So, and the leadership is deviating from the call to Islam and getting involved into power, and many members of the Muslim Brotherhood are giving up on the association. And the main factors that have impacted the discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood is that they have been involved in conflicts. And the last thing I would like to say, if time allows, just in 1 minute. As a summary, the ideologies which use slogans and do not achieve nothing on the ground and mislead the audience, they will fail sooner or later. Why? Because they cannot achieve anything. We have so many examples of that, starting from the theory of divine delegation, going So the fascist experience in Italy and Nazist experience in Germany and the ex-Soviet Union with the Marxist ideology, and now different religious ideology in the Asians, and you know them. None of these achieved their slogans, including Muslim Brotherhood, did not achieve the slogans they were calling for. And so all those slogans have failed, and I think that the slogan is going to fail as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bashir. Sorry for that. I'll go straight on to our next two speakers, who will be speaking on the duality of the Muslim Brotherhood and its media rhetoric. So first of these two speakers is Dr. Rokni Nasr, who will also be speaking in Arabic. Dr. Rokni is an Egyptian writer and expert on political affairs and director of Arab Institute for Studies. He has previously worked with the Al Arabiya television channel in Dubai. Nasira is also the author of several books, including Al-Qaeda and Salafi Jihadism, Salafism in Egypt, Post-Revolution Transformations, and also the Pioneer of Human Rights in Egypt. So without any further ado, Dr. Rokni, the floor is yours.
مساء الخير عليكم.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Trends Center and those who organized this symposium and the attendees. In my paper, I'm going to talk about the duality of Muslim Brotherhood media and rhetoric. So we have now like 90 years of Muslim Brotherhood in history. It's very important to know that there are different phases of the discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood. We have thousands of platforms that reflect the voice of Muslim Brotherhood, but some platforms do not reflect that officially, but they do unofficially. At the beginning, I see that there are many features that we should talk about when we tackle Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is like the father of political Islam in the region and in the world, but it is also, and this is dangerous thing, is that the main organization that can absorb different dimension. It can have jihadist organization, Qaeda organization, because Brotherhood in the speech of Hassan al-Banna, we have weaknesses and strengths. Hassan al-Banna had a political and pragmatic objective. That man, he would marginalize the doctrines. He can deal with Iran, with Turkey, with any regime that doesn't belong to its Islamic ideology. He is pragmatic in his alliances. He can marginalize the religious jurisprudence. He can say that music is illegal, but he has other voices that would say that music is allowed. He has different voices for growing the beard. He has voices that can be customized for different things. He has voices for fighting the others and voices for not fighting them. So this pragmatic, customized way in expanding his way of acceptance is a feature in the discourse of Muslim Brotherhood. They had Abdul Rahman al-Banna, brother of Hassan al-Banna, who was supervising the artistic works, and they had also Sayyid Qutb, who was extremist, who would be creative and talk about governance. But there are also Muhammad al-Ghazali and those who seem to be more moderate. So with the political objectives, this can be a point of strength but also of danger for Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood can generate more violent groups, and they can address big numbers of loyals. So I was focusing in my paper on the current situation. There is a diversity of expressions of Muslim Brotherhood. They have platforms, and some people endorse their discourse, whether it's about Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, and they are not fighting a specific group, but they are fighting different people in the Arab world, and they are communicating with each other, and they launch campaign and they manage to succeed. They have different branches that they are working with each other. The danger is that this group, this Muslim Brotherhood that started after the falling of the Ottoman Caliphate, it has imposed itself with a religious conviction. Hassan al-Banna was not a religious scholar, and he had alliance with the Saadiin and the Sa'i political party, and they also had the ability to show up in a civilian appearance, but they had that ego of assimilating evolutions and dividing countries, and they would deny the responsibility and not recognize it. There is a word of the guide who would say that the Muslim Brotherhood members do not apologize. They always have that kind of arrogance. They would not apologize. But the danger is that according to the timing, they would use a certain language. If we have seen them in 2011, they would say would not run for the election, but they did. They said they would not go to the parliament, but they did. They were promising the democracy, but at the end they did not care about the objection of different representatives of the Egyptian churches, and they had to leave the committee of the constitution, and the church was attacked. So this intention of assimilating everything and not honoring their promises, and the use of this pragmatic discourse, which would make them lose the commitment and not recognize the mistake, and they would have temporary alliances like they did in the 80s of last century with Al-Wafd party, and at the same time would present a threat to the Egyptian regime with jihadist groups like Al-Sunnah until the late leader Morsi would return. This ability to diversify the alliances, but at the moment, at different social media, Muslim Brotherhood are not focusing on what is not focusing on hard media, there is a marginalization of the religious, and they try to talk to people with whatever would be convenient to them. They try to embarrass the regime, starting with the problem of the construction of roads in Egypt to pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. They always try to attract the loyals according to what is suitable to their agenda, but not for the interest of the other people. So this shift in position and ability to move easily, thinking that people will forget, and then people will just join them and get attracted to them. My paper is very long. I have noticed 7 patterns. They try to instigate people in social media against the regime that go against them. There is a pattern of division. If Egypt has an agreement with Greece, you say that Egypt is taking care of its borders with Greece, but it has forgotten Al-Nahda Dam. So they'll tell you that there is Al-Nahda Dam. So this is like a strength for them. So this is like a weakness for them. This is Muslim Brotherhood discourse. Among the features of the Muslim Brotherhood discourse is that they try to marginalize the nation. They consider the nation state as a nation that was built by the colonizer. So like for Algeria or for Egypt or for the UAE, or they consider all those countries, unless it is something that would be continuous for forever. But they consider the nation state that were established in the Arab world as an artificial country, and which suffers from legitimacy. And General Guide Mahdi Akif would say something bad on Egypt, like saying Egypt can go to hell. There is the pattern of casting out and the pattern of evolution, and they would, for example, use a contractor as someone who would instigate evolution, although that person had no political intention. He's just like a clown. His main problem is who is going to pay. And
برضه اعتمادا على الصورة، واحنا في عصر الصورة، واعتقد اي
And if we study the speech and also the image, we can see that they can fabricate videos and say that we are witnessing now some large manifestations. Like the previous speaker, Dr. Basil, said, the Muslim Brotherhood is living a crisis, and some of them have been arrested and sentenced. And we have seen recently that like Bahim Munir, who is the acting general guide, is trying to instill trust in his loyals. He's talking to them in the name of religion. He's talking to those who are not his loyals by politics, and he's talking to the West with the language of human rights. And I think it's important. We see that the Muslim Brotherhood can never give up on the idea of conspiracy, and that the regimes have always betrayed the citizens, and they consider that the idea of marginalization of the nation, even if they're not using the word the caliphate, but you would have some members of them in Egypt who would say it. But so when they address the West, they would use human rights. But when you tell them, when you ask them about the human rights of the Coptics, they will say, let's go back to the Sharia. So they are wearing masks that will give them acceptance in different areas, but that shows only the pragmatic approach. It's important for us to know the weaknesses of these members. They try to divide. We have Egyptians, we have Saudis, this Muslim Brotherhood. They always talk in the name of the nation, in the name of the unique Islamic nation. As much as they say that they have Islamic ideology, they marginalize anything else. They say if you want to hear legitimate music, you should listen to such sheikh. So this is not a righteous Salafist group. So they have manipulation. I think the main thing of the Muslim Brotherhood is the conspiracy. They would say that Trump is against us, the West is against us, the whole world is against us. It's a war against the world. And so this takes us back to what Sayyid Qutb said about the battle against the capitalism. They always want to exploit the conflict, and they try to use jihad, and that was very clear. So like Bin Laden said, so it is important for us to be aware of the weaknesses, which at the same time represent points of adaptation for them, and it's important for us. It's important for them that the success of the nation state is always a defense against them. And when every time they come, they say the West and Israel, the other, the infidel, the universal conspiracy, and at the same time they are using the West. We need to disclose that the danger is we are dealing with the ideological discourse, not a political discourse, but the main objective is politics. So the ideology is clear. We need to disclose it continuously. We need to have dialogue with it and score it continuously. So we need to disclose the national identities which are legitimate and which is the main thing that can achieve the state nation. And none of the Arab nation would succeed as a whole nation with combining different nations. So the state nation is the only model. So this it is also important for us not to talk to them with the usual discourse. And there was a conference of Al-Azhar a few months ago, and the criticism was about governance, and the people who started saying that the caliphate is a historic issue. Sayyid Qutb said that governance was not mentioned in any Quran text, not in religious jurisprudence. and they consider religion as governance, they consider divinity as heredity. So Al-Azhar, as a moderate Islamic organization and independent as well, has criticized the ideas of caliphate and the governance of Sayyid Qutb, which consider religion as a regime, as an old Roman empire. So this courage in criticizing them and their ideology, this awareness, the Muslim Brotherhood weaknesses and strengths, they do not recognize their mistakes, they do not apologize for them, they do not they consider the others as traitors. Everybody is like betraying them. They always have this discourse that rejects the other and deny the legitimacy. If you ask them about the achievement of any ruler in history, they would deny the achievement, or except for the war of 1948, in which Muslim Brotherhood participated. So they always deny the role of the others. So those are their weaknesses. It's important for us to disclose them continuously. It's important to disclose this hatred and this arrogance that they have. It's also important to document the testimonies of separation of some of the members, like the first group which left Hassan al-Banna. All those who started thinking properly left Muslim Brotherhood. It's important to disclose that and document it and translate it. It's important for us to react and to not be limited to the reaction. So I should not just react to that. So that things would be clear. I hope I was not very long, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hani, for that presentation, for that insightful discussion. I will now move on to our third speaker, who is Mr. Yotam Feldner. He is the director of the Middle East Media Research Institute Television, or MEMRI TV. Mr. Feldner graduated from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and started working at the Middle East Media Research Institute as a researcher in 1998. In 2004, he launched MEMRI TV, which monitors and researches free-to-air and online TV channels in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, and other languages, and also produces subtitled excerpts made available to the public, media, academics, and governments. He has been the director of MEMRI TV ever since. So without wasting any time, Mr. Feldner, the floor is yours. I would just like to remind all our speakers to please keep your presentations to 10 minutes, just so that we can get through the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'll be focusing on the TV channels of the Muslim Brotherhood, which we at MEMRI have been monitoring for as long as they existed. For many years, the Muslim Brotherhood has been very successful in portraying a positive image for Western audiences. In their appearances on Western media outlets, Muslim Brotherhood figures usually present their goals in the following terms. First, the Muslim Brotherhood advocates coexistence and can bridge the gap between the Islamic world and the West. Second, like Dr. Hani said, the Muslim Brotherhood goal is to guarantee the civil and human rights of Muslims both in the Arab world and in the West. And third, the Muslim Brotherhood is an agent of moderation. It is the representative of true Islam, which is the middle way between the jihadi extremism on the one hand and the secularism on the other. But when we compare this rhetoric to Muslim Brotherhood discourse in Arabic on the TV channels in the Middle East, a different image, of course, emerges. Today, there are two main hubs for Muslim Brotherhood media. One is Doha, which is the headquarters of the various Al Jazeera channels, and the other is Istanbul, that hosts a growing number of Egyptian and other Muslim Brotherhood TV channels. These include Kamilin TV, El Sharq, Channel 9, Watan TV, Libya Al-Ahrar, and other channels. Historically, the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab world had very limited access to TV channels, which were almost exclusively controlled by the regime, by the state. When they were allowed on TV, their statements had to conform with the state policies. In Egypt, it was only in the late days of the Mubarak regime that Islamists who were not part of Al-Azhar University were allowed to establish their own niche TV channels where they were able to discuss their ideology so long as they refrained from directly challenging the state's domestic policies. When Mubarak was ousted in 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood gained free access to the mainstream media in Egypt as well. But all this ended abruptly when the Morsi regime was overthrown in 2013, of course. The Muslim Brotherhood figures who managed to flee Egypt set up shop in Turkey. There, they built a network of channels that promote the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and its agenda against the Al-Sisi government, as well as the other political battles of the movement. In these channels, the rhetorical duplicity of the Muslim Brotherhood becomes evident. The Muslim Brotherhood employs two rhetorical lines in the media: a pragmatic discourse, which is reserved mainly for Western media, and an ideological discourse, which is common on TV channels in the Middle East. Unlike the rhetoric in the West, the Muslim Brotherhood discourse on their own TV channels in Qatar, Turkey, and elsewhere in the Middle East is violent, intolerant, anti-Semitic, misogynistic, and hateful. Let's examine the issue of coexistence with the West and the interrogation in Western society. The Muslim Brotherhood has advertised itself as a beacon of coexistence and has been involved in a lot of interfaith activity with Christian and Jewish organizations, especially in the US. These Jews and Christians are obviously clueless regarding the political Islam and its goals, which are discussed freely on MB TV channels in Qatar and Turkey. For example, we can turn to one of the leading Muslim Brotherhood mouthpieces in the West, Azam al-Tamimi, who lives in London and runs the Muslim Brotherhood main Arabic TV channel in the West today, Hiwar TV. In a 2009 show on Al Jazeera, al-Tamimi fended off the claim that there was an attempt to Islamize Europe. This was against the backdrop of the Switzerland minaret ban at the time. So this is what Azam al-Tamimi said. No Muslim in Europe is trying to impose Islam on the non-Muslims. Westerners portray Islamic law as a boogeyman. If they learned Islam, they would accept it passionately. Islam saves them from the tragedy of their lives. The Europeans are wretched people. A man goes to work early in the morning and returns home drunk to have dinner in front of an entertainment show on TV, and then he goes to sleep, only to wake up early in the morning, and so the story repeats itself. All this so he can pay taxes to this country in which the Europeans lead a life of stupidity. Islam liberates them. Islam gives their lives a meaning. Obviously, this kind of rhetoric does not come up in all the interfaith conferences or in Azam al-Tamimi's appearances in Western media outlets. The second feature of the Muslim Brotherhood pragmatic discourse revolves around civil liberties and human rights. Needless to say, this is an area where many countries in the Middle East are lacking significantly, and complaints about violation of human rights and the thwarting of the democratic process have been lent a sympathetic ear in the West. The MB discourse depicts the Arab people as victims of their regimes, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood is presented as the only genuine representative of those oppressed people. The political goals of the Muslim Brotherhood take the back seat in its pragmatic rhetoric directed at the West. And the movement is said to be seeking to establish in the Arab world the same human and civil rights and the same democracy that exists in the West. This sounds commendable, but there are some qualifications. In the MB-affiliated regime in Qatar, Turkey, Gaza under Hamas, Egypt under Morsi, human and civil rights were not improved and sometimes have worsened. In addition, from the MB rhetoric in Arabic, it is clear that the goals of the organization are political and it is striving to take power in the Arab world and instate Sharia Islamic law. Now, is the Muslim Brotherhood really an agent of moderation? The language that is heard on the Turkey-based TV channel is much closer to the rhetoric of ISIS and Al-Qaeda than to that employed by the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. In these channels, the rhetoric of passive victimhood that is such a common feature of the MB discourse in the West makes way to a much more ideological speech about the glories of the past and the victories that are yet to come. The colonialist West is sometimes described as the Crusader West, and a global rule of Sharia law or a caliphate is presented as a desired objective. For instance, historian Dr. Muhammad Ilhami, a TV host on Kamelin TV, prayed for further Islamic conquest so that the world may taste the joy of living in the shade of Islam after having tasted the humiliation of living under other nations. And a Libyan researcher Ali Essibai, said on his show on Channel 9, America wants to oppress and grab each and every region. This mentality can only be smashed by jihad, not defensive jihad, but offensive jihad, jihad al-talab. Even incitement to murder is not a taboo on these TV channels. TV hosts and commentators on the Muslim Brotherhood channels have called for the assassination of leaders, journalists, diplomats, and tourists. For example, in a January 2015 show on Rabia TV, Salam Abdelakawi, who had held a governmental position in the Morsi regime, called for the assassination of President Sisi, stating that this would be a good deed that would bring the killer closer to Allah. Other commentators and hosts on these channels have also called for terror attacks against foreign interests in Egypt, as well as against journalists, tourists, and diplomats. In January 2015, Muhammad Awad said during a show on Mr. Allah on TV that journalists who support President Sisi should be killed. The crime of the accomplice is equal to the crime of the perpetrator. The punishment of those journalists should be death. This violent discourse was also evident in the recent coverage of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons and the series of terror attacks in Europe. The MB TV channels were entirely engrossed in their criticism of France and French President Macron and showed little interest in the terror attacks there. If anything, they demonstrated understanding for the motives of the terrorists. In conclusion, there is a clear duplicity in the discourse of the Muslim Brotherhood as it is reflected on TV. In the West, the MB portrays a meek and passive image, and its rhetoric focuses on claims of social and civil victimhood. However, in the MB TV channels in Qatar and Turkey, the image is one of power and triumph, with political goals that are akin to those of all the other radical movements of political Islam. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Feldner. We'll come back to you maybe during the Q&A session to get more of your thoughts on this. But I'll now quickly just move on to our next speaker, who will be speaking on the topic of the Brotherhood's media wings, funding and sources of support. He is Dr. Nicholas Ryder, Professor of Financial Crime at the University of the West of England, United Kingdom. Dr. Ryder has taught at the University of Glamorgan, where he was awarded a PhD for research into credit unions' role in the United Kingdom. His main research interests are financial crime, money laundering, market manipulation, and terrorism financing. Dr. Ryder has also provided counterterrorism financing training for NATO, CEPOL, and also numerous other law enforcement agencies. So we look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Ryder, the floor is yours.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen with everybody. Bear with me. There we go. So I suppose good afternoon or good evening. Just like to thank you all very much for inviting me to present at the conference today. It's very much appreciated with the webinar. Just to give a little bit of background about me, I've been teaching law for approximately 10 to 15 years, and I tend to specialize in terrorism financing. So I'm going to give a different slant, a different overview today. And as you can see, The presentation is also with the support of one of my PhD students, Charlie Robson, who's been helping me with some of the presentation. I'll do my best to speak as slowly as possible. I do have a tendency to speak very quickly, so I will take my time over the next 10 minutes or so. So the presentation today is going to be divided into roughly 3 main parts. I'm going to look at the background to the Muslim Brotherhood, and to look at some of the consequences and some of the plans by the President Donald Trump in terms of attempting to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and then to briefly then look at the consequences of what might happen, because the legality of it in America is rather complicated and very controversial. I'm then going to look at what the consequences could be if that was designated by President Trump in the next sort of 10 to 12 weeks, depending on the US election result. And then I'm going to move on to look at what the potential sources that could be exploited by the more extreme radical wings of this particular organization. So obviously, with any research on terrorism, financing or financial crime, it is very difficult to precisely identify what the potential avenues are. So some of those will link into the media tools which have been used by a broad range of relevant organizations. So by way of background, one of the most controversial aspects of, I suppose if we can call it, the financial war on terrorism, which was instigated by President George Bush in September 2001, is the ability of different nation states to designate an organization as a foreign terrorist entity. So the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, as you can see from the slides, permits the US State Department to designate an overseas terror group if 3 criteria are determined. So firstly, it has to be a foreign organization. Secondly, it engages in terrorism, or has the ability or intends to do so. And then its actual activity that threatens US security. So Donald Trump has indicated on several occasions in the past 3 years, they're looking to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So there is a draft bill which has been debated by US politicians entitled the Muslim Brotherhood Designation Act of 2017, but that has not yet been implemented or signed into law. Now, if you look at this power in a little bit more detail, there's a very important US Supreme Court case from 2009, which is Holder versus the Humanitarian Law Project. In that particular instance, the Supreme Court ruled that irrespective of whether or not an overseas organization is a political entity, that is not the sole reason which it can be designated as a terrorist organization by the US State Department. So I am aware that the Muslim Brotherhood has been designated as a terror group by several different jurisdictions. But if the US does designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group in the next 3-4 months, then there are significant consequences for that entity. So the consequences are, we have the provisions from the United Nations, in particular, UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which was implemented just after the attacks in America in September 2001. The cornerstone of that is Resolution 1373, which is binding on every member of the United Nations. There are similar provisions by the European Union and also the Financial Action Task Force. But if you break the laws down, what you end up with is what some people refer to as the financial war on terrorism. So one of the definitions that I sort of worked on and identified 5 years ago in a research project is you look to criminalize terrorism financing, confiscate assets, freezing, and also the sanctions regime. And it's that particular sanctions regime which can have a global reach under the US Treasury Department and in particular the Office of Foreign Assets and Control. So that means that if the Muslim Brotherhood are designated a terrorist group by the Americans, then overseas companies, corporations, charities are going to be unable to actually operate with the Muslim Brotherhood. So that can pose a significant threat to a variety of institutions and organizations. Now, in terms of any potential funding avenues with terrorist groups, it is very difficult to pinpoint precisely how groups are financed. But what we have been able to identify with this particular project is a fraud funding typology. And these have been extensively used by multiple terrorist groups. So, for example, Al-Qaeda used immigration fraud and identity theft to fund the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. The 9/11 Commission itself claimed that all of the terrorists entered America illegally with fake passports. There then is an issue regarding credit card, personal loan fraud and bank fraud, tax fraud, insurance fraud, but also the non-profit sector. And the non-profit sector is highly susceptible to misapplied donations, where research suggests by academics that the terrorist group will top slice a very small percentage of payments made to charities, frequently used by Al-Qaeda. I would recommend looking at the work of Professor Jimmy Gurula, an American professor from the University of Notre Dame, who's written some excellent detailed studies on how the non-profit sector can be abused by terrorism financiers. Mortgage fraud, there are several cases in America where people who are affiliated to Al-Qaeda and more recently ISIS have been attempting to accrue finances via mortgage fraud. And more recently, we have multiple examples of benefit fraud being used to fund acts of terrorism in the Netherlands, in Holland, and also within the UK. And more recently, perhaps more broader, we have what we classify as trade-based fraud. If we click onto the link on the PowerPoint slide, that will take you to a summary of the presentation, which is free to download from our UB repository. Other modes of financing is something that we call cheap and inexpensive model of terrorism financing. This has proven to be very popular in the last decade, where terrorists are able to essentially self-fund themselves. So what we've ended up with is the evolution of cheap and inexpensive terrorism financing mechanisms. Multiple examples over the UK, we've seen terrorist attacks in the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, the UK, and also recently we've seen terrorist attacks in Vienna and also in France. So this is a frequently used method used by multiple terrorist organizations. And then penultimately, we have a more recent and perhaps new method of funding, which is the hierarchical or corporate or company terrorism financing model. This was initially used in the UK and Ireland by the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. And it simply means that the terrorist group operates as a corporation. That means it pays its employees, terrorists, if you like, a weekly salary. So they have an accountant. So quite different to how Al-Qaeda is funded. And we published a 2018 paper on the funding models of ISIS. And we concluded that they have a very similar funding model to how the IRA were funded over the last 30 to 40 years. So ISIS would have multiple propaganda streams, social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, also by using encrypted messages such as Telegram and WhatsApp. And they have an annual budget, and so even their own currency. So it's taken the terrorism financing models to a new unprecedented evolution from how things were financed possibly 40 to 50 years ago. Now, what might be of interest to you is a recent study that will be published just before the end of this year, and that looks at the social networking funding model. And what we've been able to ascertain with this particular academic study is that terrorist groups are now beginning to modify how they're financed and will use social media platforms, but in conjunction with crypto assets or cryptocurrencies, e-money, and that proves to be very difficult to prevent and detect. So the association between illegal activities and the internet is very well documented. We have the infamous case of Silk Road and the conviction of Ross Ulbricht in 2015. I suppose it can be classified as an online bazaar for narco-terrorists, money launderers, and sex offenders. We have Liberty Reserve and Western Express, but the last two cases are particularly relevant. So, for example, I'm obviously conscious of time. Zubia Shanaz in particular stole $62,000 from her bank via credit card and bank fraud. And she attempted to then transfer that money to known sympathizers of ISIS in several jurisdictions across the world. And she was arrested and prosecuted under US terrorism financing laws and was then subsequently sentenced to 13 years imprisonment in March of this year. So what we can see from the variety of funding models that could be exploited is that there is an evolution. Terrorism financing has evolved from the traditional state-sponsored terrorism, as some people would suggest, in the 1960s and 70s during the Cold War. It's evolved from private donations, as in relation to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef in terms of the attacks in America by Al-Qaeda. So they're now using social media platforms, and they're now using the dark web. And it's possible to argue that anybody who has access to a cell phone or a tablet or a computer could possibly be involved in terrorism financing. So that should give you a very brief overview of the difficulty in designating a group such as the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. The consequences could be significantly far-reaching. But of course, until it's designated by America and its European allies, I obviously appreciate it's been designated by other nation states as a terrorist group. That should give you a flavor or hopefully an overview of the potential funding streams which could be used by terrorist entities. And I think that was hopefully just under 10 minutes for you. Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Nicholas Ryder, for keeping to the time and also for that insightful presentation. So we're going to move on. We're cognizant of the fact that we are already 1 hour and 15 minutes into our session. So we've got 4 more speakers. And the next topic of presentation is on brotherhood and the digital media space, between its employment and impact. And speaking first on this topic is Dr. Najat Al-Said, who is an independent researcher in political communication and development, focusing on the GCC region, American politics, and also combating terrorism. Her research areas include development communication, focusing on health, education, and social development, mainly women's empowerment. She has a PhD in media studies from the University of Westminster, United Kingdom, and a master's in computer information systems from the American University in Washington, DC. Dr. Al-Said has published several articles in the Washington Post, Gatestone Institute, Gulf News, and also Al Arabiya English. So without any further ado, Dr. Al-Said, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me today, and thank you for the coordinators of Trends. I would like to thank also Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali and Dr. Ahmed Al-Istad. Today I'm actually going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood because I believe a lot have discussed that topic. But what I'm going to focus today on the reasons behind failing to counter the terrorism of the Muslim Brotherhood. After we noticed all of these facts that have even been discussed by the speakers today, why until now we couldn't counter the terrorism of the Muslim Brotherhood? So I'm trying to explore some of the reasons. So one of the reasons for that is the lack of bipartisan agreement. So the lack of any bipartisan agreement within the United States and even in other European countries, as the UK, on critical matters in the Middle East, especially those related to political Islam, as the Muslim Brotherhood has aggravated polarization in political parties and in their related media. As a result, the right-leaning parties and their media hold one position, the left-leaning parties and their media hold another, which further inflames tensions. This was even reflected in the US election, if there was a bipartisan agreement on these critical matters, especially the ones that are related to stability and security of the region, we will not see the Middle East region that concerned about the US election. So, for example, what we see today, everybody's talking in the region how the Biden administration will be. Will it be similar to the Obama administration, or will he continue what Trump has started? For instance, the foreign policy of the previous Obama administration was very different to that of the Trump administration. The Republican administration is opposed to the Iranian nuclear deal agreed by the Obama administration and opposes the Iranian regime's interference in Arab countries. The Arab administration is also opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood and has considered designating it as a terrorist organization, while the former the Obama administration supported it during what is known as the Arab Spring. In addition, the leftist groups and lobbies funded by pro-Muslim Brotherhood parties in the United States are trying to block Trump's the designation. All of these tensions between the right and left are exploited by Islamists, including the Muslim Brotherhood. So the second reason, the deception of the Muslim Brotherhood to the West. As has been discussed earlier by the other speakers, the danger of those political Islam groups as the Muslim Brotherhood is that they present a tolerant version of themselves to the West and their true radical selves to the Arab region, which might be deceptive to some political parties that are not aware of that. So the liberals in the West, such as the Obama administration, found political Islamists as the Muslim Brotherhood to be convenient antidotes for extremist groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda, because they view them as versions of moderate Islam that could tame terrorist groups. And here comes the danger. Liberal Westerners also equate taking on political Islam groups as the Muslim Brotherhood to taking on Islam. So if you call among some Westerners the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists as terrorists, they will call you Islamophobic and call you other names. On the other hand, conservative parties find that political Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood are a gateway to extremism. See the difference between the two views? So supporting them means supporting terrorist groups as Daesh and Al-Qaeda because they all belong to the same extremist ideology. This might explain why the anti-political advocates in the region are more allied to conservative parties, while advocates of political Islam are allied to liberal leftist parties in the West. These are the differences. So here, the region and the whole world is divided, and accordingly, political Islamists are taking advantage of this. The third reason, the problem with the mainstream media and the siding with the Muslim Brotherhood. Since international broadcasting, mainly the mainstream media in the United States and the United Kingdom, is dominated by the liberal left, they indirectly support political Islamists as the Muslim Brotherhood, referring to them as moderate Islamists to distinguish them from extremist groups as Daesh and Al-Qaeda. And sometimes the mainstream media goes farther to that side. So they do not only side with political Islam advocates as the Muslim Brotherhood, but also attack the anti-political Islam advocates. So instead, we see in the mainstream media in the UK and the US criticism or disclosure to the double face of the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, we see attack on Saudi Arabia or UAE and Egypt and countries that are truly fighting the extremist ideology established by the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islamists. We saw that in the Washington Post, we saw that in New York Times, we saw that on CNN and in the Independent and the Guardian and many other Western media. For example, we see in the mainstream media, the bias against Saudi Arabia has intensified significantly since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a strong advocate of the Muslim Brotherhood, ignoring most of the murder and imprisonments of journalists in Iran and Turkey. So the question is why the attack in the mainstream media is on Saudi Arabia particularly, and not on Iran or Turkey that have murdered and imprisoned many journalists? Is it truly a question of human rights and freedom of speech? Or is it a matter of ideological differences that if Saudi Arabia or UAE or Egypt was revolutionary, politically liberal, anti-capitalism, with bad relations with the Republicans, politicians, will the mainstream media still attack or will it be quiet? The answer might be that most likely that the mainstream media might not attack them. So here we all come to the conclusion and we ask ourselves that ideological motivation and partisan interests are more important to the liberals or leftist parties and their media than fighting terrorism. All of that is going, and we see that all of that is actually exploited by political Islamists as the Muslim Brotherhood, because they take advantage of this ideological motivation and partisan interests and partisan differences. Adding to the lack of consensus in Western countries, there is also lack of consensus in the Arab world. So some Arab countries see political Islamists as the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorists, and others see them as allies. Even the Arab Gulf states differ in this matter. For example, Kuwait and Oman have taken a more lenient approach towards Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, while Saudi Arabia and the UAE have a more hardline stance against it. So this lack of consensus makes it hard to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So because I hear say that the Muslim Brotherhood is terrorist, and another neighboring country and another Gulf country say, no, those are my allies. So here comes, the big difference. And and all of that is taken advantage by the Muslim Brotherhood. I just want to shed a light on what happened in the media during what is called the Arab Spring. There is no doubt that the Muslim Brotherhood got a lot of support from the Obama administration and a lot of Western countries and their media during what is called the Arab Spring. The mainstream media gave the impression that the Muslim Brotherhood are liberal supporters of democracy without going back to the violent history. Just a few minutes ago, a lot of you have presented the violent history of the Muslim Brotherhood. But during what is called the Arab Spring, most of the Western countries were portraying the Muslim Brotherhood as pro-democracy, pro-liberalism, while they're not. In fact, all of these violent groups' ideologies from Daesh and Al-Qaeda to Hamas are derived from that of the Muslim Brotherhood. The key and most dangerous difference is that the Muslim Brotherhood has mastered the double face, presenting a tolerant, moderate, even liberal version of themselves to the West and their true radical selves to the Arab region. As a result of their extremism, Egyptians protested against the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood on June 30th, 2013, and called the help of the military to topple the Muslim Brotherhood. But the mainstream media in Western countries, as in the US and UK, didn't support that and called it a military coup. For example, the Obama administration had provided extensive sympathetic coverage and political support for the January 25th revolution against Hosni Mubarak in 2011, but didn't support the people against Morsi. As a result, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between mainstream media as the CNN and the websites of those mainstream media coverage of the June 30th revolution and the pro-Muslim Brotherhood Qatar based on Jazeera. A lot of Arabs at that moment were saying, are we watching truly CNN or this is another version of Al Jazeera? They both took, because they both took a suspicious stance to events in their coverage, reinforcing the idea that they share the same concept of support for the advocates of political Islam. Unfortunately, the mainstream media support for the Muslim Brotherhood did not stop even after the failure of the so-called Arab Spring, but continued until now. But however, we find that the only time Western politicians become truly serious about the danger of political Islam when there is a terrorist attack, as we saw in France and Austria lately. The problem, when the warning comes that late after an attack, it might backfire, and some people, whether deliberately or not, might interpret that as Islamophobic. Islamists will immediately interpret that as attack on Islam because they don't want to be scrutinized. and some liberals in the West might see that as politically incorrect. And in both ways, that might be taken as an advantage by Islamists. Islamists, as the Muslim Brotherhood, always take advantage of the split between parties and lack of consensus. Accordingly, the terrorism of the Muslim Brotherhood and the widespread of their extremist ideologies won't be confronted without global consensus politically and in the media. Otherwise, we will keep repeating ourselves on and on and on without any resolution as long as there is no consensus. So here, my recommendations to the to some Arab countries that are anti-political Islam. The first thing that should be done, targeting left and right-wing media. The anti-political Islam advocates in the Arab world should be writing for the left and right-wing press to explore the danger of political Islamists as the Muslim Brotherhood and make it clear that without fighting their ideologies, terrorism will prevail. Secondly, an English language satellite news channel. It is essential to launch a satellite news channel in English by the anti-political Islam advocates in the Arab world. Another suggestion can be launching even a YouTube channel translating the Muslim Brotherhood radical comments in Arabic TV media, something like The Memory, but more intensifying on on the Muslim Brotherhood and what they say in Arabic, and try to compare what they say in Arabic to what they say in English to show their hypocrisy and double standard to the Western public and the Western world. Thirdly, improving lobbies. The anti-political Islam countries should not only depend on lobbyists in Western countries run by professionals and politicians, but also try to develop grassroots base. These grassroots should understand and explore the danger of the Muslim Brotherhood organizations in the United States and other Western countries, as the Council on American Islamic Relations CARE and the Muslim American Society. I try to be as brief as possible because it's a big thing, and I don't want to be redundant with other speakers. So I focus on why this issue has been like going over and over without a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Said. Next up, we have Dr. Jonathan Matusitz, who will be speaking on a similar topic. Dr. Matusitz is a tenured associate professor at the Nicholson School of Communication and Media, University of Central Florida in the United States. His research focuses on communication in terrorism, symbolism in terrorism, the globalization of culture, and health communication. Dr. Matusitz has published 6 academic books on terrorism, specifically on terrorist motivation, communication, and also behavior. Occasionally, he is a featured speaker at law enforcement workshops and training sessions. He has also delivered presentations on terrorism to numerous agencies, the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, and also local sheriff's offices. So, Dr. Matusitz, please take it away. You will need to unmute, Doctor.
Thank you. I would like to thank everybody for being here, and I would like to thank Trends for organizing this symposium. And we have a great line of speakers. Today, I will talk about the Muslim Brotherhood in Belgium and its impact on Europe and its attempt to create a caliphate. The problem started in the 1980s when it was implemented there. Today, the Muslim Brotherhood has over 500 organizations in over 28 countries in Europe. In Belgium, there are about 20 to 30 Muslim Brotherhood organizations, and they want Brussels, the capital city, to be the epicenter of the Muslim Brotherhood so they can reach out to as many countries as possible. In Brussels, there are between 200 and 300 mosques, including Molenbeek. And Molenbeek is actually a suburb of Brussels. And this is where most of the terrorists of the Paris attacks, if you remember the attacks on Paris in November 2015. They came, it was implemented in Belgium, it was just thought out in Belgium, and most of the terrorists came from Brussels and that Molenbeek suburb. And yes, Brussels is the European capital of the Muslim Brotherhood because Brussels is the seat of the European Union. Geographically speaking, Brussels is at the very center of Europe. And the other problem is that the Muslim Brotherhood, even in countries like Belgium, is well funded. They get funds from private donors. They get funds from Qatar. Think of the Qatari charity organization. The Great Mosque of Brussels in 2017 had an operating budget of $1.6 million. Most churches don't even have half that amount. The Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, warned Europe that the Muslim Brotherhood wants to turn Europe into a Muslim Brotherhood continent. So the Muslim Brotherhood are a clear and present danger. What are the objectives of the Muslim Brotherhood in Belgium? Number one, the Muslim Brotherhood wants to lobby European institutions by using Belgium as an epicenter, as a platform. I would like to give you the metaphor of the octopus, you know, the animal and in the seas. The octopus is 8 tentacles trying to reach out to as many animals so they can just eat the animals. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is a giant octopus with hundreds of tentacles so they can reach out to as many people as possible. And they prey on young Muslims, creating an image of victimhood, and we'll get there in just a moment. Promoting radical worldviews. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to promote radical worldviews starting at the individual level. They tell Muslims whom to marry, how they should dress, what they should do on a daily basis, but also at the societal level, trying to create a divide between the real Muslims, the good Muslims who are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, with the apostates, the fake Muslims, as they say them, the infidels, the kuffar, the kufir. And then at the national or international level, trying to reach out the goal of creating a caliphate, a radical system of Muslim government that will impose Sharia in all countries on the planet, both Muslim and non-Muslim countries. And promoting Wahhabism is a third objective of the Muslim Brotherhood. Again, they want to create the us versus them dichotomy. They want to focus mostly on the verses in the Quran that are more violent, that subjugate both Muslims and non-Muslims, non-conforming Muslims. So it is a real problem. Now, what are the strategies of the Muslim Brotherhood in Belgium? Number one is symbolic terrorism. The first thing we need to look at is their logo. If you look at the logo, it is a Quran with 2 swords, 2 crossed swords, and a verse, and the verse from the Quran is chapter 8, verse 60. It says, prepare yourself for violence. Terrify the enemies of Islam. That's one example of symbolic terrorism. As the previous speaker, Najat, said, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood use double discourse or double speak. So what they say in public is very different from what they say in private. Whether it's in English or Arabic, when they speak in public, they present a positive facade. They present a good face of Islam, of the Muslim Brotherhood. But when they speak in private, they're misogynistic. So they talk about subjugating women. They talk about subduing and subjugating the infidels and the apostates. They talk about creating the caliphate. They urge people to join the global jihad movement. Victimization discourse is another strategy. When you hear them speak in the media, they always talk about being marginalized, about being ostracized. They're being isolated. They're being victimized by the greater society, by the dominant society. We are the victims. Muslims are the victims of the Jews and the Westerners. We have been the victims for the past few centuries, for the past 1400 years. the problem with the victimization discourse is that it works. A certain number of Muslims, mostly Muslim youth, buy into that without being aware that they're being misled and deceived by the Muslim Brotherhood. Diffusion of falsehoods, I can give you hundreds of examples, but for the sake of time, I'm going to give you one example. When they talk about women having to wear the veil, what they're talking about is not true. They say that women have always had to wear the veil for the past 1400 years, but this is not true. That notion of wearing the hijab has been fluctuating, and it hasn't been true in all Muslim lands. It has not been true either across time and history. So it has been fluctuating. So they use a lot of deceit and falsehoods to give their own version, to present their own version of Islam to Europe and the world. And a fifth strategy would be shutting down criticism of their radical doctrine by using labels, by imposing labels on their enemies, by preventing speakers from speaking at various venues. So what I'm going to do now is give you a few examples of pan-European organizations based in Belgium, and then I'm going to talk about local Muslim Brotherhood organizations in Belgium. But let me start about the international organizations of the Muslim Brotherhood based in Belgium. For example, we have FEMISO, the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. That was created in 1996, and it is an umbrella group. It consists of more than 40 Muslim youth and student organizations. The average age of the Muslim participant is 25. Most of them are between the age of 18 and the age of 30. And they have to take classes, they go to summer camps. It's almost like a Boy Scout camp, and they learn how to fight racism, how to fight Islamophobia, how to attack anybody who's critical of the Muslim Brotherhood. Another group based in Belgium that's international is the FIOE, the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, that was founded in 1989. The problem with FIOE is that it has links to terrorist groups like Hamas, like Al-Qaeda, and definitely the European Muslim Brotherhood. We also have the European Forum of Muslim Women that focuses on equal rights, equality, that always talks about Islamophobia and how countries like Belgium have subjugated them. Just so you know, Muslims in Europe have a lot of rights. They can worship, they can openly try to convert other people to their faith, they can marry whomever they want. But yet, as I told you a few minutes ago, they use the victimization discourse based on deceit and falsehoods. And the ultimate objective is the same, to create a global caliphate. And then we have the European Muslim Network that was founded by Tariq Ramadan, who, as we know, is the grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. And Tariq Ramadan has huge contacts with Qatar, and the EMN, the European Muslim Network, is definitely funded by Qatari charity organizations. Local associations of the Muslim Brotherhood based in Belgium. This one, the first one, the League of Muslims in Belgium, the LMB, has been designated by the UAE, by the United Arab Emirates, as a terrorist organization in 2014. And the UAE also designated CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, as a terrorist organization. Now, why should it be called a terrorist organization? Because they do advocate the joining of the global jihad movement to its adherents. This is the most important one in Belgium. It's based in Brussels, but it has tentacles in Ghent, in Antwerp, in various cities in Belgium, and they're being funded by Qatar, and they're doing everything they can to turn Belgium and then the rest of Europe into a Muslim country and a Muslim continent. And then we have the ECICV, the Educative and Cultural Islamic Complex of Verviers. Verviers is in the eastern part of Belgium, okay? And we know what's going on with them because one of the main leaders of the ECICV left the group and wrote a book about everything that's going on. His name is Michael, okay? And he wrote a book called When I Was a Muslim Brother, right? It was written in French and it has been translated in a few languages. And what does Michael say about his Muslim Brotherhood group in Verviers? Well, the same double discourse, you know, they present a nice image in public, but when they talk in private, it's a whole different story. They urge Muslims to join the global jihad movement. They're misogynistic. They talk against women. They talk against infidels and the apostates. We have Empowering Belgian Muslims, the EMBEM, and their specific tactic is to shut down anybody who tries to blow the whistle on the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, the most famous French author today is Éric Zemmour, right? Let's call him Eric. And he wrote a book a few years ago called The French Suicide. And the French Suicide that came out in 2014 is based on the premise that countries like France and Belgium are committing cultural suicide, in the sense that they do not listen to smart people like people working for the UAE or Saudi Arabia who have warned Europe to be careful of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a snake. It is a clear and present danger, but most Western governments are not listening to the UAE and to people who are warning Europe. So Éric Zemmour was not allowed to speak in any venue in Belgium because groups like the EMBM have been shutting down people like Eric. And I can talk about other minor groups like the Active Diversity Entrepreneurs. No, it sounds like a business group, but it is also a snake. That wants the caliphate and the collective against Islamophobia in Belgium. Any criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood will be conflated with Islamophobia. So if you take a step back, you look at the big picture. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a monolithic entity. It is not a single, it is not like a structure that looks the same everywhere. Just like the octopus and tentacles, they will use various strategies and tactics to convince the world that they are the ones who should lead the world and create the caliphate. Well, I would like to thank you for listening to this. I'm looking forward to listening to answering questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Metasits. You can stop sharing your screen. Thank you very much. We have two more speakers for this session. Moving on to Dr. Noha Malor, who will be speaking on the future of the Muslim Brotherhood's media rhetoric. Dr. Malor is an academic based in London. She is the author of several books on Arab media and culture, including The Making of Arab News, Modern Arab Journalism, Reporting the MENA Region, and Voice of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was her latest publication. She has also recently co-edited the first comprehensive handbook on Arab media, which was published this year. Dr. Malor is also a former journalist at the BBC World Service. She has published commentaries in several outlets, including the New York Times, Reuters, and Financial Times. She has contributed to several international organizations, including Freedom House, Oxford Analytica, the EU Mediterranean Diplomats Training in Malta, and also the Danish Institute for International Studies. So without any further ado, Dr. Malor, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, so I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but I want to address the Brotherhood media discourse, drawing on my recent book, The Voice of the Muslim Brotherhood, which traces their media discourse from 1928 until 2013. And my core argument is that the Brotherhood media have been used to brand the movement. And especially after 2013, their TV and online media have ironically magnified the tensions within the movement, demonstrating the identity contestations among the members. I argue in the book. Sorry?
I know that I messed it up. I'm just going to be upset all day, but that's okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Malor, please continue.
Okay, so I argue in the book that the movement literally died with Hassan al-Banna back in 1949. What remained was a society that used what I call al-Banna brand, just to prove its historical roots as one of the oldest movements in the region. And this explains why their leaders kept drawing on the original brand's attributes, namely al-Banna and his messages, as their blueprint instead of developing these messages to suit the present circumstances. Now, the main mission of the Brotherhood movement was to garner voter support, like in Egypt, and not necessarily to attract genuine new members, because core membership, as well as promotion within the movement, was usually confined to a small circle of people bound together by strong family and business relationships. In my book, I suggest a timeline of their media activities, which demonstrates the rise and decline of their media discourse, and I divided it into 6 stages. So I referred to the book, of course, and I urge you all to read it. But their media was intended to serve several functions: to mobilize supporters, to attract attention to its unique, what I call faith brand, and to provide a platform for the leaders, not anybody, but the leaders, to promote their decisions. Discursive tools used by the Brotherhood generally include the use of religious arguments based on direct citations of Quran and Hadith to gain legitimacy, and using vaguely defined mottos such as "the Quran is our constitution" to gloss over the deficit in their political manifesto, while broadening the type of issues covered by such a vague manifesto or a vague motto, and delegitimizing opponents in the political sphere, such as accusing them of being agents of Western enemies. Since 2013, the leadership of the Brotherhood has heavily depended on the international network to reach out to members in Egypt and abroad. And by mid-2014, as we know, they set up several satellite channels, as other colleagues have already talked about. Now, claims of corruption also emerged, like when Ayman Noor, who manages Sharq TV, together with Ibrahim Munir here in London, were accused of seizing large sums of money dedicated to paying for their staff salaries. But what I wanted to say in the book is that despite the variety of outlets, there was no unified communicative strategy among the Brotherhood, especially after 2011. And the media discourse has demonstrated the deep divisions within the movement, with some members supporting the use of violence, like in Egypt, while others prefer to explore the means of reconciliation. And this propaganda has, more importantly, revived the debate in many Western countries on whether the Brotherhood's mission is peaceful or radical, and re-examining their discourse about non-Muslim communities. Now, this is very important because their call to implement Sharia in a state like Egypt, for instance, where constitution draws on Islam as the main source of legislation, has resulted in an intense debate about the rights and status of non-Muslim groups, obviously the Christians, but it's also worth highlighting their anti-Jewish discourse. According to the Brotherhood ideology, Western cultural values are depicted as a source of moral corruption in Muslim majority countries like Egypt and others. And central to this ideology is the belief that Western societies, or what Brotherhood leaders call crusaders, not only intend to halt the progress of Islamic societies, but to hinder the full Islamization of these societies. And the solution then for the Brotherhood is for Muslims to maintain their distance from Western cultures, while labeling any critics of the Brotherhood as agents of crusaders. Also, the Brotherhood has tended to Islamize the conflict with the West and Israel by using anti-Jewish discourse. And I mentioned several examples in my book, and they all claim that the Jews had instigated global wars and conflicts, talking about the so-called Jewish conspiracy. And this discourse is still alive in the leaders' statements. In fact, their leaders tend to depict Western countries and Israel as an alliance of plotters against the Islamic nations. Now, throughout the past decades, their media has repeated the same narrative, claiming that the events facing the whole region were part of a calculated plot against Islam, which the good Muslims ought to win in the end, and the Brotherhood has assigned itself the role of the leader to lead Muslims in their jihad against the enemies. And to support these allegations, the Brotherhood usually published materials that tended to rely heavily on extracts from the Quran and Hadith, taking out of context, of course, to argue that the present conflict is somehow the direct continuation of a historical struggle with the Jews. Several supporters, such as Al-Qaradawi, blamed the rise of such extremist ideologies in the movement on Sayyid Qutb's writings. However, Qaradawi's views were never moderate either. For instance, in one of his famous books, aiming to refute the Takfiri ideology, he defended the Takfirists, arguing that one of the reasons behind the Takfiri trend was what he calls the leniency of the clerics towards those Qaradawi called infidels. And then he went on to identify the true infidels as those who denounce their faith, singling out the communists, secularists, and members of selected sects such as the Druze. So, in summary, the movement branded itself as the only viable movement, and it commanded its members to dissociate themselves from other groups in society and to refrain from reading material deemed by the Brotherhood as aiming to destroy Islamic ideas. So instead of encouraging learning about and debating ideas, the movement leadership engaged members in a tacit and constant war with the West. If some members called for a debate or more transparency, they could be accused of serving the Western agenda in causing internal divisions. Now, I think we should actively engage in deconstructing this conspiracy theory by questioning the quality and reliability of its evidence and disputing its foundation instead of either dismissing the concept as an irrational paranoia or embracing it as the only truth without verifying its simplified view. What the whole region, the Arab region, needs is knowledgeable citizens whose access to information can help them to participate as fully as possible in public life and to gather information and looking for hidden biases and understanding one's own bias as well. Only serious debates and critical thinking can lead to tolerance, respect, and acceptance of the diversity of Arab societies, because analytic thinking cannot live alongside Takfiri ideology. As for the future of the Brotherhood, I refer here to a conference held in September in 2019, organized by the Brotherhood International Network in Turkey, to discuss the future of the movement. And it was promoted as a form of a call for reform of the movement. Now, the challenge with such calls for reform, in my view, is that it's unlikely to create consensus within the movement, divided between an old guard that clings to traditional messages of Al-Banna versus a new guard that seeks to part company with the past and start afresh. Also, any reinvention of the movement, like drawing on different branding tactics, may result in a movement that hardly resembles Hassan al-Banna's original project. So ultimately, the movement runs the risk of instigating a new stage of soul searching that may last for at least another generation. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malor. We'll be moving on now to our final speaker for this day, and he is Mr. Muhammad Al-Sawafi. who will also be speaking in Arabic. Mr. Al-Sawafi is the director of the Parliamentary Media Department in the UAE's Federal National Council. He has worked at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research as a researcher in Gulf Affairs, editor in the Media Department, and as Director Publications Department at the ECSSR. He holds a master's degree in international relations from Coventry University in the United Kingdom. Mr. Al-Sawafi also writes articles in several Emirati newspapers on issues related to political Islam in Iran. He also frequently appears in television talk shows and shares his views on the UAE's foreign policy. So we'd love to hear more from you, Mr. Al-Sawafi. Please, kindly, if you could begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. the Chairman, and thank you, my colleagues, and thank you, Trent, for inviting me. First of all, if I want to talk with everything I have in my paper, I will be just repeating whatever everybody said. So I will follow two aspects. First, try to be very short, and secondly, try to give some points from my paper on this topic. So the topic, like Dr. Noor has said, considering the future of the Muslim Brotherhood and media, my paper is a critique of the media of the Muslim Brotherhood and the media that is affiliated and supporting them. I focused in my paper at the post-2011 as a phase that made a difference for this organization. And the third point in my paper is for the media I consider as amputated if we don't tackle the content of this media, and we should not be limited to the means but also the content, because sometimes the channels are known but the content may not be clear enough, especially for such organization, because we know that it is a very discreet organization. Another point in my paper is that when we talk about the experience of Muslim Brotherhood would be limited if we don't focus on Egypt as the country where the Muslim Brotherhood was founded, and they had a social and political position. So media also is important. We need to focus on media in Egypt. So we know that they exist now overseas, but Egypt is the main source. I have split my paper into four aspects. The first theme, I called it the pre-2011, and the main features of this phase, as I consider, is that the media was not among the priorities or the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were not interested in attracting more fidels. They were trying to contact other members directly because of different reasons that were connected to some judicial processes against them and the pressure that was building up against them from the government from the days of Jamal Abdel Nasser till the days of Hosni Mubarak. So this process of them not being showing themselves in the media, and even when they were showing themselves, they were not tackling politics, but it was for social or educational topics. They tried to stay away from politics. They only did that after 2011. So the post 2011, and after they met with Omar Suleiman, that was a secondary phase. That's when the media was empowered. Like my colleague said, they had media before 2011. It was electronic media, but it was not that strong. It was not that omnipresent. But after this phase, after they met with Omar Suleiman, they felt that they have some political weight and they can show up in the media. So they had like 25 channels, and like Dr. Basil said, we have many examples. We have seen them in the media. They started having different shows for dialogue. The third phase, which is after 2013, after July evolution, this phase was about victimization for them and doubt. They tried to convey the discourse to the world and to say that the so-called democratic government has collapsed. Then they tried to get the compassion of the public opinion of the world and superpowers of the world so that they can get back to power. And they always tried to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the government, especially the Egyptian government that they call as the government of evolution. And I think this does not serve them, given the awareness of the Arab state and the Arab people and the discourse that we hear from our colleagues in the West. We consider that they have realized the danger of this organization, and we need to work with the West into controlling this organization. I think now Trump is at his final days, but what happened in France and in Austria is enough for us to understand the content of the discourse and the danger and the impact it would have on the media. This is what we expect from them. This is the third phase concerning the nature of the media of the Muslim Brotherhood. I will move now to the forecasting of the future. I will focus on 2 or 3 points. Each point has some ideas. We have the experts with us who have tackled those points already, but I think I can repeat those ideas. So if we talk about the tools, now Muslim Brotherhood, they are using different media outlets, including social media. But the impact, I think they are using the TV mainly, and certain people, but those are not having an impact because people are not the same anymore. And the impact on the social arena is not that important because the youngsters are not going to listen to the media discourse, especially in the Arab world. The outlets they are using are not righteous, and the content is no longer valid because that offensive discourse is no longer convincing and is not acceptable by the Arab world. So the future is clear. And the second point is about human resources and financial resources. Till now, they are focusing on outdated media. I can mention the names: Muhammad Nasr, Mu'taz Matar. I think they are not convincing to the Arab world, and there is no new generation of the youngster who would like to join them. So regarding the human resources, I don't think they are qualified, and they don't have media staff for that. And for the financial aspects, we can say that Qatar is the only country that still pay them, especially Al Jazeera and Al Arabi, but the international crises are enough to make those sources dwindle for them, and there's no hopes for them for the international environment incubating the Muslim Brotherhood. As I said, we had Trump, we had the attacks in France, and now we have in Austria. And politicians in the West are getting aware of the danger of this organization. So the continuity of the support doesn't exist. There are internal divisions in the organization. It has impact on the media of the leadership. They are not organized. The media discourse will not be valid. This is all what I have in my paper, and I think my colleagues have tackled different other points. So if you allow me to summarize, the media of the Muslim Brotherhood started after 2011 as a strong media. It did exist before as media of people, but as an organizational media, it was only after 2011. The future of the media of Muslim Brotherhood, we cannot talk about it without talking about an internal crisis. There are divisions inside. It has an impact on their work. The third point, the content, I can say it's not acceptable. And thank you, Mr. the Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Sawafi. So I'm cognizant of the little time that we have left. In fact, I think that we've kind of run overboard with this session, but we have a couple of questions, and I'll maybe limit it to 2 or 3 questions that we can perhaps go through. So one of the questions that has come to us is the opinion that American and European political leaders do not really understand the Brotherhood and its and political Islam more broadly. So in your view, our speakers, how can the strategic challenge of the Brotherhood, including their use of the media, be made clearer to political figures in Western countries? I think some of our speakers, like Dr. Najjar, Dr. Malor, have touched on this. Perhaps we can start with you if you wish to expand on this question a little bit more.
Who's you, Dr. Noha or me?
Dr. Najjar, maybe we can get you to unmute.
Okay. Okay. I just want to I want to know the question is directed to whom. I thought to Dr. Noha. Yeah, regarding the lack of understanding, look, there are many reasons for it. One of it is lack of understanding, truly, because the Muslim Brotherhood are playing the double game. As we said previously, they show that they are moderate. Some of them look some of them are intellectual. They are academic, and they speak multi-languages, but they don't show their true ideologies to the Western world. So accordingly, they could deceive a lot the Western public and the Western politicians, because of the those people do not know the language, first of all, and they do not know the culture. So some of them haven't read or haven't seen what has been exposed in Arabic, and that's what we, the other part, should be informing the West. So that's why we should emphasize on talking in English, on writing in English, so the public, the Western public, should understand that. This is number one. Number two, and I see it quite dangerous, okay, because there's a huge split inside the Western world. For example, the leftists want to fight the right parties in the West. So what they do, they use all the parties that are against the right. So accordingly, they don't want to fight the Islamists in Europe and the US because they're using them for their own political interest on the expense of fighting terrorism. And here comes the danger. Otherwise, why we think that some members or sympathizers with the Muslim Brotherhood are in Congress and in European politics? Because they are using them for their own agenda on the expense of fighting terrorism. So here, tell me, what is more important to you, fighting terrorism or your political agenda? So that's why, sometimes we ask ourselves, since you know all of these facts about the Muslim Brotherhood, why you are keeping them there, why you are keeping them even powerful in Europe and in the United States. The third thing that should be done, the other counterpart, those who are against political Islam and against the Muslim Brotherhood, should be working much more. They should be writing, as I said, targeting both left and right media in the West to make at least the Western public aware of it. There should be definitely satellite channel in English. And I like really the work that Memory is doing. They're doing excellent job. I wish we can emphasize on that and do something much more powerful and funded on that matter. Because if we keep speaking in Arabic as if we are speaking to ourselves, we have to expose that to the whole globe. And definitely, we have to work in lobbies. Unfortunately, the anti-political Islam in the region doesn't have a strong grassroots base in the West. Or most of their dealing is dealing with governments, while the other part, they have grassroots base. For example, Qatar has really strong base in the US. They have a strong base with the Arab American Muslim Brotherhood in Europe and in the US. They're using that. While, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE do not have that grassroots base. So accordingly, they are weak to influence the public in the West. They don't have that hard grassroots, and that's what they should be playing through more putting more effort with the Arab American community, for example, and try to establish institutes that counterpart institutes like CARE and like MAS. That's in my point of view. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I mean, there are many reasons, and I like to believe that Western governments, like European governments, have good intention in that they want to, spread the virtue of diversity and respecting the others and tolerance. But as I said, I believe that we can't really spread or subscribe to that value of tolerance without debating the conspiracy theory promoted by the Brotherhood and the like. But also, like Jonathan has talked about, the Brotherhood International Network, like in Europe, is quite strong, and somehow throughout the past decades, they managed to convince European governments that that their network somehow has or can mobilize Muslim communities in Europe, like here in the UK, when in fact this is far from true, because Muslim communities in Europe are very diverse. Like here in the UK, they are very diverse. We can't claim to actually lead them or be able to mobilize them. So I don't want to say that European governments are naive. They are not. But as I said, I would like to believe that they had good intention at heart. So, but what I believe now is that we really have to, it's time to engage with the conspiracy theory promoted by any group, not just the Brotherhood, by any Islamist group. And as I said also in my talk, I think the many Western governments have now realized the contradictory messages within by the Brotherhood leaders, oscillating between messages calling for violence versus those calling for reconciliation, but also for the sake of misinformation, which has become a very big word at the moment. So, for instance, I can refer to the Facebook published just last week, a report about inauthentic behavior. So in their report from last week, they said that they have already singled out around 30 or over 30 fake Facebook accounts. They removed them, along with, I can't remember, 20 something Instagram accounts operated, as they said, by individuals in Egypt, Turkey, and Morocco associated with the Brotherhood. And they targeted countries like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. So for the sake of not spreading misinformation, we should also engage with what they with this conspiracy theory.
if I may add something, the problem with most European countries, they do not allow voices like our voices to speak out. In Belgium, it's a one voice policy. The media is owned by the government, so you will never have Fox News or any right wing or any independent media source telling the truth on the Muslim Brotherhood. So people like us get shut down. So I wish European countries, and I'm talking about continental Europe, had more freedom to speak out.
Thank you for those insights. I'm just going to go to one more question before we wrap up, and maybe we can get Mr. Feldner and also Professor Ryder to weigh in on this, because this question has essentially two elements. So where does the Muslim Brotherhood develop its media apparatus or broader communication strategy? And by extension to that, which maybe Professor Ryder can touch on, is where does this funding come from for such a monumental media strategy in that sense, and who helps them with it? Are there any suspicions that they're getting help from other countries, or whether in the Middle East or overseas? Maybe we can get both of you to weigh in on that.
I think it's quite difficult to precisely pinpoint who supplies the funding. This is part of the difficulty with any research, scholarly activity, or investigation into any form of alleged funding. And there are some publications by the Financial Action Task Force that suggest certain private donors in named countries provide finances, but of course, and unless people are convicted in a court of law, I don't think it's appropriate for me to suggest what the countries are, and that's part of the problem with any funding avenues. I think what we found through our research is that there are so many different funding avenues which can be exploited. That can be through private donors. It's very well documented examples of 9/11 and the official inquiries and academic studies into that, how that was perceived to have been financed. So I'm sorry, I can't give a specific answer, but because there are multiple sources available, what we found is that certain organizations with links into terrorism entities can exploit a multitude of funding avenues, which makes it very difficult to firstly precisely say who finances them, and secondly, in terms of law enforcement agencies, to actively investigate them and then prosecute. So I'm sorry I can't give a specific example, but it is very much based upon secondary sources, which I really wouldn't want to sort of affirm without a more detailed study. So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be uncommittal, but I just don't think there is a clear answer to the question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, for the TV channels, the Muslim Brotherhood TV channels in Turkey, I was trying to find out on the net, like who owns them, who finance them, and it's practically impossible to find it out. Like it's not a matter of public records; they don't identify themselves as anything, and with open sources, you just, I mean, with some exception, like Shark TV, it was bought by Ayman Noor, but who knows where he got his money and who's behind him, and so there isn't a good answer to that, unfortunately.
We are out of time, but if I can just quickly maybe ask one of our Arabic speakers to maybe offer their final comments or weigh in on some of the questions that have been raised. Perhaps Dr. Hani or Dr. Basil, if you wish to make some final comments just in under 1 or 2 minutes, please go ahead. Sure, go ahead, Dr. Basil.
من الدراسات اللي اطلعنا عليها والبحوث، وشفنا العلاقات الصميمية بين القناة القطرية جزيرة تحديدا، وبين القنوات القنوات الميادين أو القنوات التلفزيونية الأخرى، وجدنا هناك ثمة علاقات قوية. عثرت على بحث والحقيقة مو بحث تحدث فيه أكد
in which Mr. Abdulrahman Sabih was one of the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood and left it. He disclosed that Qatar used to send to the UAE, to Dubai, at a training center, journalists from Muslim Brotherhood so that they can be qualified to work overseas. In another study, we found that Qatar was giving $10,000 to each person who would come to present an event or a program at Al Jazeera as kind of support to them. So this is what I think happens, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Basim. Dr. Hani, please. Yes.
I have one comment. As all the speakers have said, the Brotherhood, they always have this dual aspects. The ideological aspect exists deeply, and it hides the main ideology. And I join my voice to Dr. Nuha in the theory of conspiracy and looking down on the nation and the features of the Muslim Brotherhood discourse. This element, we see them continuously, and we need to disclose the tactics, and we need to empower counter tactics, counter values. And there was a comment made by Dr. Al-Sawafi. The experience has become a main setback for the Muslim Brotherhood. The previous experience in many places have made them experience failure because they have the thinking of a group and not of a state. So documenting the experience and the focusing of denying the others, these things are like setbacks for them to get power. I think the future is confused for the moment, and they are focusing on what they are trying to showcase as mistakes of the other, and focusing on certain states, and so they're trying to add anything just to guarantee the survival, but they are going through a deeper crisis. So, and everything was perfect before they came, and now they still have lots of obstacles because of the people are against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rani.
Thank you.
So I would love to continue this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, but unfortunately we're out of time. On behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank all our panelists once again for taking the time to join us today to share your knowledge and expertise. Before we leave, I'd just like to quickly point out on behalf of Trends that they will be holding another e-symposium, which will be entitled Artificial Intelligence, Fiction to Reality, which is planned for Tuesday, the 24th of November, which will also begin at 7 p.m. UAE local time. And this symposium will feature global experts in AI from RAND Institute, one of the leading think tanks in the USA, also from places like Accenture, MIT, and Google. So do look forward to that. Once again, a big thank you to Trends as well for organizing this timely symposium. Thank you to all our speakers for contributing to this discussion, and to our audience members, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again at the next symposium. Assalamu alaikum, and very good evening or good night to wherever you are. Thank you.
Good night. Bye.
Good night.